Hey guys, here with another limited review video for Battle for Zendikar here on the Nitzahon Magic channel. I've done a top 3 commons and top 3 uncommons video for every color, and a top 10 rares and mythics you want to open video, and this is the other top 10 list. There's only one more limited review video left, and I'll be doing a video about all of the archetypes that I see as possible in Battle for Zendikar Limited. But this list is the top 10 list, the top 10 bad cards that might try to trick you. So this list is made up of cards that I feel like people will perhaps be inclined to play, but that aren't actually good cards. A good example of these, they were both on my list last time, but I saw people play them all the time in Magic Origins, were a Crow and Jailer and Bellows Lizard. Those are both cards you don't really want to be playing, but people seem to play anyway. And this list is more cards like that. Cards that might seem good at first glance or might seem playable with a certain line of thinking, but I'm sort of going to dispel all of these cards and talk about the problems with all of these cards that either make them unplayable or make them a lot worse than they seem at first glance. So first we have a couple of dishonorable mentions. They're kind of in the same group as Bellows Lizard and a Crow and Jailer were in Magic Origins. They're 1-drops, and they're not especially good. 1-drops are almost never worth playing in limited 1-drop creatures unless they're really good, and neither of these are. Kitesail Scout is a core scout, doesn't even have the decency to be an ally. If it were an ally, it would at least be slightly more worth playing because of all the rally cards in this format, but it's not even an ally. It's a 1-mana 1/1 with flying, and a lot of people will look at that and think, you know, that's pretty good, and they're kind of right. In constructed, it would be an okay card, but even then, it's not that great. But 1 mana for a 1/1 flyer just doesn't do enough. You've got to think about cards in limited, especially, but in every format really, at every stage of the game. And if you top deck this late, it's not going to do much more for you than chump block, or maybe start pecking away at your opponent. But doing 1 damage to your opponent at a time isn't going to kill them very quickly, and it's just not. It's not worth playing this 1-drop in your deck 99% of the time. Kitesail Scout would be a little better if the format had actually had good equipment or good enchantment auras, but it has almost none of either that are worth playing, so Kitesail Scout's not especially good. There also aren't a lot of Anthem effects, ways to go wide on your opponent. There are a few. If you ended up with a bunch of them, then I could see playing Kitesail Scout, but even then it's a little questionable. The other one's Lava Step Raider. He's 1 mana for a 1/2, so he's slightly above rate, but he'd be way better if he were like a 2 mana 2/2 with this ability. That's just how things are. You know, a 2 mana 2/2 can take down a lot of creatures without any investment, and it's the same problem with Kitesail Scout. It just probably isn't going to trade with anything ever, and it's eventually just going to not be able to swing at your opponent, and it'll just have to chump block. Lava Step Raider is a 1 mana 1/2 who does have an activated ability, 2 and a red, to give him +2/+0, so he's comparable to Bellows Lizard. I'd say they're about equal, but maybe Lava Step Raider is just slightly better because it has 2 toughness, but its pump ability costs 1 more, but it does give it +2/+0. So maybe Lava Step Raider is slightly better, but I would still almost never play it. You're almost never going to be wanting to pump a bunch of mana into that, so he's effectively not a 1-drop, because if on turn 3 what you're doing is pumping all your mana into making him a 3/2 so he can trade with something, you're not adding to your board very much, and so Lava Step Raider, it has sort of a similar problem to a Crow and Jailer too at a 3 mana activated ability. You just aren't going to have the time. I mean, this isn't as fast of a format, to be fair, but you're just not going to want to be tapping all of this mana just to pump your mediocre Lava Step Raider. Neither of these cards is especially playable 99% of the time. You may encounter situations where you could play them, but most of the time these aren't going to be very playable. Alright, so now we'll jump into the top 10 list, and here we have an ally. A 2 mana 1/1 already, that's not great. You don't want to be playing 2 mana 1/1, so he better do something amazing, right? Right, well he doesn't. He has an ability that could work really well if there was enough sacrifice things in this format, but even then I probably wouldn't play him. Whenever he or any of your creatures dies, your opponent loses 1 life and you gain 1 life. There is a life gain theme as well in this format. Like if you build a black-white deck, you're probably going to have cards that care about life gain, but even despite that, Zolaport Cutthroat just isn't very good. He's 2 mana for 1/1. He's not going to trade for hardly any other 2 mana creatures or more in the format. He is going to let you bleed your opponent a little when he dies, but it's not enough to matter. He's a lot like a really bad version of the 1 in black 1/3 guy from Dragons of Tarkir who had exploit, and whenever you exploited something, your opponent lost 2 life and you gained 2 life. He was borderline playable, but Zolaport Cutthroat is like a really bad version of that. I would almost never play it. If I ended up with a black-white ally deck that had a lot of life gain effects in it and a few sacrifice outlets, maybe I'd play him, but a lot has to go right for that to happen. He's almost always going to be unplayable. You just don't. This isn't what you want to be doing on turn 2 most of the time. And in a similar vein, we have Calastria Healer, another black ally. Unfortunately, black did get a few allies, but all the common and uncommon ones are kind of... These 2 aren't even really worth playing. The other one's playable, but not awesome. This one has Rally, and it has the same sort of effect. Whenever Calastria Healer or another ally enters the battlefield, each opponent loses 1 life, and you gain 1 life. Now, if this were a 2-mana 2/1, it would actually be pretty good. And, you know, that seems like a small difference, but it's actually a massive difference. A 2-mana 1/2 can't trade for almost anything worth playing in the format. It can just die to it. You know, 2-mana creatures, you know, are usually going to have at least 2 power, and sometimes they're also going to have 2 toughness, so the healer can't kill things. Its rally ability can be pretty cool in a deck where you have a way of getting a bunch of allies into play at once, either with, like, you know, having Gideon in your deck, or having there's the white card that puts a bunch of core allies into play based on the number of colored mana you use for it. That could also be kind of cool. But even in a situation where you have lots of allies, this isn't one of the allies. This is one of the allies you would cut first. There are better allies in white for sure, and black doesn't really have good ally support, as we saw 2 of the allies they printed for it have just been seen. Could also maybe be good in a deck where you actually have a big life gain theme, but even then, it's not especially playable. Generally, with that life gain deck, and I'll talk about this more in my archetype video, I would only want to play cards that would be good even without their life gain abilities, or at least playable. And Calastria Healer and Zolaport, what was his name, Cutthroat, are not that. I wouldn't want to be playing either of them most of the time. Next, we actually have a rare. It's Prism Array. It is a pretty cool card, pretty cool design by R&D for sure, but I don't think it's especially playable. This is going to be a format where Converge matters. This is going to be a format where if green is your base color, running all 5 colors won't be impossible, and running 3 or 4 will be pretty easy because there's just that much fixing in green. Despite that, though, Prism Array is just not that good. Even if you pay 5 mana for it, and they're all different colors of mana in Magic, you get 5 crystal counters on your Prism Array, which just means you can tap 5 creatures. So think about this, maybe as a sorcery that costs 5, tap 5 target creatures. That would be relatively playable because it's such a big effect, but you have to have 5 colors of mana for this to even do that. It does have an additional ability that is sort of tacked on there, a pretty cool ability of Scry 3, where if you have all 5 colors of mana, you can Scry 3, which is pretty cool. But again, you've got to have all 5 colors of mana to do it. This is possible in this format, but I don't think you're going to be wanting to tie up your mana that much to Scry 3, although again, that is pretty powerful. And the effect can be pretty powerful too, the tap target creature effect. But you've got to be basically a 5-color deck for Prism Array to be worth playing in your deck. There's way better ways of getting creatures out of the way in blue that are much cheaper and don't involve you spending multiple colors of mana. So this is a cool flashy card that maybe at times could fit into your deck if you're running at least 4 colors, but you really have to run 5 to get full value out of it because of the scry. So it's really just not very good. I would recommend against running it most of the time. It's going to be one of those rares you end up with like multiple copies of because nobody's drafting it. So, look forward to that. Next, we have Slab Hammer, one of the equipment in the format. Almost none of the equipment in this format is playable. There's one I do think is playable that you saw in my top colorless cards video, and it's still kind of borderline playable, so it's not amazing. And Slab Hammer is no exception. It's not an especially good equipment. It is a card that I think will excite some people because of the synergies it can have with the red-green Landfall deck, which is where you're going to get the most like Landfall triggers that are really cool, is in the red-green deck, and Slab Hammer helps you with that. So it's a 2-mana equipment to equip for 2, And whenever a creature attacks, you can return a land you control to its owner's hand. If you do, the creature gets +2/+2 until end of turn. So, alright, this gives you a surefire way of getting landfall every turn, and that's pretty cool. What's not cool is that Slab Hammer does absolutely nothing if you don't want to return a land to your hand, and it does absolutely nothing for blocking. Absolutely nothing. So your creature can attack and get bigger and trigger a landfall. You're definitely going to have a landfall effect. But it only does so on offense, and it doesn't get a huge bonus either. +2/+2 isn't enough to make a difference. If it had trample tacked onto it, maybe it would probably be more. It would certainly be more playable, and maybe even a borderline playable, especially in the landfall deck. But the fact that it does nothing on defense, does nothing if you're not in the mood to be wanting to bounce your lands because you'd like to actually do something one further up on your curve that turn, then Slab Hammer does nothing. And if you already have a land in your hand, like you drew a land on your turn, so you can trigger landfall anyway, returning a land to your hand isn't a huge bonus on that turn anyway. I mean, it does give you one more landfall trigger your next turn. But Slab Hammer, not especially good. Has some exciting synergies maybe with the red-green landfall deck, but I think most of the time you'd rather just not run Slab Hammer and you'd rather just have another land in its place because it's just a card you're going to dump mana into and not get enough out of. Next on our list, we do have a card with landfall, and it's the 1-mana 0/3 Jaughty Offshoot. A 1-mana 0/3 is okay. I mean, it can block some early attackers, but this isn't Magic Origins. It's not a format where you need these early blockers to keep dudes from getting renowned. It's a much slower plotting format. So a 1-mana 0/3 is mostly just going to keep one guy from hitting you every turn that has less than 3 power, and that's not especially exciting. For the first couple turns, maybe it does something. It does have landfall, but its landfall ability is really lackluster. Whenever a land enters a battlefield under your control, you gain 1 life. Gaining life can be useful against certain opponents, of course, but the life gain theme is mostly in black and white, so Jaughty Offshoot doesn't even fit into that deck, the deck with the life gain theme. And so it's just not very good. Most of the time you don't want to play it. I could see siding it in against a really fast ally deck where both gaining life and keeping them from smashing your face in early is good. But I don't think people should be playing this main board most of the time. Next on our list, we have another rare, and it's Defiant Bloodlord. He seems like they printed him with the intention of him being good for the black-white life gain deck. Unfortunately, they failed because he costs 7 mana, which is just ridiculous for the effect. He's a 7 mana 4/5 flyer. Decent body, but not really for the cost. And whenever you gain life, target opponent loses that much life. Now, in the rare occasion where you have the life gain deck actually come completely together, Defiant Bloodlord's going to be pretty good. I mean, I would play him, if I'm in my 3rd pack and I have 14 cards in my deck that care about life gain or gain me life, I'd play Defiant Bloodlord, but that's the only way I would do it. And the reason he's on this list is because I think people are going to be excited about him because his effect can be so punishing, and draft him early in some cases and just not be able to make the deck come together around him. And you don't want him in your deck if you don't have a way of gaining life, multiple ways of gaining life. They could have tacked lifelink onto him or something and given him, I don't know, tacked lifelink on him would have been too much probably. Maybe 2 power or something and lifelink would be interesting. Yeah. Defiant Bloodlord, I would recommend against playing 99% of the time. Occasionally it'll come together. Like I said, the life gain deck I think will be at its best when you play cards that are playable anyway without their life gain effect. And Defiant Bloodlord definitely isn't that as a 7 mana 4/5 flyer. Alright, so now we go to another piece of equipment. This time we have Pathway Arrows. It's a 1 mana spell at least, so it's not a huge investment, but its equip cost is 2, which is a big investment. And then the effect it gives your creature isn't even a statistical bonus. It's just this creature deals 1 damage to target creature. And you have to pay 2 mana and tap your guy for that. If a colorless creature is dealt damage this way, tap it. Okay. So people get excited about ping effects a lot, but usually they're manaless and they can also hit your opponent. In this case, it can't do either of those things. It costs you have to pay 2 mana to equip it. You have to pay 2 mana to use this ability. And it only does 1 damage to creatures. And it only taps down colorless creatures, which there are a lot of in this format. But the mana, it's just so mana intensive. It doesn't look like it is. But you have to spend 5 mana over multiple turns probably just to tap down a colorless creature or do 1 damage to a creature. And that's just not good. Pathway Arrows is incredibly inefficient. If it had no mana cost, it would probably actually be playable. Like if the effect was just this deals 1 damage to target creature. If a colorless creature is dealt damage this way, tap it. It would probably be playable, borderline. But as it stands, it's not. This is a card I would almost say never, ever, ever play. But there might be rare occasions where you play a crazy colorless deck and you don't have much removal, and the only way you have a hope of winning is by siding in a Pathway Arrows you picked up with like your 14th pick. So there may be rare occasions where Pathway Arrows makes it into your deck out of your sideboard, but it shouldn't be doing more than that. Next, we have Brilliant Spectrum, and this card costs 4 and it has Converge, and it's draw X cards, where X is the number of colors of mana spent to cast Brilliant Spectrum, then discard 2 cards. Now, this effect seems like it could be powerful, and I think it would be. If it were on an instant, this would be a playable card. But as a sorcery, it doesn't impact the board at all. You have to invest 4 mana into it. And you don't even get to keep all the cards you draw. You draw, let's say you have you're a 5-color deck, and you can just pump 4 mana into this, draw 4, and discard 2. That's not an especially good rate. As an instant, drawing 4 and discarding 2 would be an okay rate. But as a sorcery, it really isn't. And that's the absolute best case scenario with this card. If you're a 2 or 3 color deck, it's completely useless. Not completely useless. Like if you're really desperate to dig in your deck, I guess Brilliant Spectrum as a draw 2, discard 2 is still pretty bad, to be honest, because you just have to invest 4 mana into it. So it's just not especially good. It's a card that if it said discard 1 card would be a lot better, but they really nerfed this card for one reason or another, and there's better card draw in the format tacked on to cards that are actually playable in most cases, and Brilliant Spectrum isn't that. People get excited about drawing cards, but this doesn't do it efficiently or effectively, even in the absolute best case scenario. All right, so on to number 2, which we have Cliffside Lookout. And this is one of the cards on the list. This is probably the best card on the list. And by that I mean it's the card that is the most playable that is on this list. It's still at number 2, though, because I think people will overrate it. It's a 1-mana ally, so it triggers Rally, and that's good. And it has an ability, and it can pump your whole team by making them +1/+1 till end of turn. And that's what makes it relatively playable. It can pump your whole team. But I think people will see that effect and think it's better than it is. You have to have a deck that goes wide, which there aren't a lot of in this format, although the red-white ally deck can do it. You also have to invest 5 mana into it for a 1-turn Anthem effect. And it's not a surprise one that can help you remove creatures unless your opponent's playing absolutely no attention. And it's on a creature that's easily removed by all the removal in the format. So if your opponent's really worried about you pumping your whole team, then they'll just deal with your Cliffside Lookout easily. It also can't really attack into most things in the late game, even when it's pumping itself. So it's sort of just like an enchantment that can chump block. I mean, it's still a creature, and it has an effect that's relevant, especially in a deck where you can go wide. But it's still not as good as people will think it is. I would never this is a card that would be like the 22nd, 23rd card to make it into my deck. And I think it gets cut something like 80% of the time. But sometimes it'll actually make it into a main board, and I think that's completely reasonable. Now, the number 1 card on this list, meaning I think it's the card that'll trick people perhaps the most, but is not especially playable, and it says 10 there, but that's clearly a mistake. So number 1 is Molten Nursery. It's a 3-mana enchantment, and it says whenever you cast a colorless spell, Molten Nursery deals 1 damage to target creature or player. Okay, at least this ping effect can hit creatures. But it's an enchantment that doesn't affect the board at all the turn you play it. It's a complete dud if you draw it in the late game. And it doesn't affect the board, especially even if you play it on turn 3 and just play colorless creatures. There's not a lot of creatures you're going to be able to kill with 1 damage in this format. There are some. And doing 1 damage to your opponent isn't a huge effect. We saw with Impact Tremors in Dragons of Tarkir, which was a faster format than this one will be, that effect, whenever a creature enters the battlefield, do 1 damage to target player, is not especially good, even in a deck really built around it. Sometimes an Impact Tremors deck could really come together if you ended up with a lot of Dragon Fodders and Sandstep Outcasts and you just really ended up with like an ideal deck. But most of the time, Impact Tremors as a card that doesn't impact the board and usually only did, let's say, 4 damage to your opponent, 5 damage to your opponent over the course of a game just isn't good enough. Like, you'd rather just play a 3-mana creature 99% of the time than play this Molten Nursery, even though Devoid is definitely going to be a deck and there's definitely going to be colorless spells to help Molten Nursery. Molten Nursery is basically the worst of the cards that's intended to fit into that archetype, and I would just say avoid it at all costs. Don't play it. So that's the number 1 card on our list. As I said, it says 10, but that's clearly a mistake. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe, and don't forget to enter my Battle for Zendikar draft giveaway, which an annotation for should pop up right now.